Hello and welcome to my second video in my mini-series all about stripes. In the previous video I showed you how to add stripes by basically adding a yarn in, then once you finish the stripe, cutting the yarn and weaving the tail in, then adding a new colour, finishing that stripe, cutting the yarn and weaving the tail in, and so on and so forth. This video deals with carrying yarns up the side of the knitting instead. This means you don't have to cut the yarn after every stripe, so you end up with a lot less yarn tails to weave in, and it's a lot more efficient. So if you are planning to alternate between 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 different yarn colours, quite frequently along the length of your knitting, then this technique for carrying yarns is ideal. Examples of when you wouldn't carry yarns is if you're only doing one single stripe in a certain colour, for instance red, and you probably also wouldn't carry a yarn if you were doing one red stripe and then not doing another stripe for a lot of rows. It's really personal preference how many rows you're willing to carry a yarn for, but I probably wouldn't carry a yarn for more than 20 or 30 rows at most. So if you're doing 2 red stripes in a project, and they're say 40 rows apart, then I wouldn't carry the yarn between the two, even though it is possible to do so. In this video I'm going to show you a couple of different methods of carrying yarn, and in the next video I'll show you how to do the same with 3 different yarn colours. Okay, so let's get going. As you can see, I've already done a few stripes and I've cut the last yarn that I used to leave a tail of about 12 inches. So really I'm starting from the beginning now for this demonstration. So I'm just going to add in the brown yarn again, using the method that I demonstrated in the previous video. However, in this example I'm going to show you how to weave both the cream and the brown yarn tails into your knitting as you go. So this is really following on from the previous video and is just a little extra trick that's really handy to know. So I make a loop with the brown yarn, with the tail away from me. I then take my right hand needle up through the top stitch, drop the loop of brown yarn over the right hand needle point, and complete a knit stitch to add that brown yarn into my knitting. I then tighten the yarns up a little bit and turn the work over. I'm now just going to organise the yarns that are sticking out of the back of this knitting. So we've got 2 yarn tails now, as well as the brown working yarn. We're going to leave the brown working yarn to the right hand side, because that's what we're going to continue to knit with. And then on the left, I'm going to hold the brown and the cream yarn tails in my left hand. And now what I'm going to do is weave those 2 yarn tails into the back of my knitting as I knit along this row. In order to do this, I take my right hand needle up through the next stitch as if to knit. Then I take the yarn tails in my left hand and bring them around the needles to the front. I then use my right hand to wrap the working yarn around the right hand needle point as usual. I then take the yarn tails back to where they started by taking them back around the needles like so. I then complete the knit stitch as normal. And this sequence of actions has incorporated those yarn tails into the back of the knitting and anchored them there. So now they're not just hanging loose. I then do a normal knit stitch, and I continue to alternate between the normal knit stitch and the knit stitch where the yarn tails are wrapped into it. And I repeat this at least 3 times. So again, I go into the next stitch, bring the yarn tails from the back around the needles to the front, wrap the working yarn, and then take the yarn tails back round the needles again. And then complete the knit stitch. And then I just do normal knit stitches for the rest of the row. I just think this is a really handy technique to know, because it lets you weave in the yarn tail whilst you're knitting, and that saves you time. And if we look on the back of the knitting now, we can see that those yarn tails blend in quite well. There are no double thickness stitches on the needle, and at the front you can't see the yarn tails at all. I then knit back along the row, so I get back to where I started the stripe. I'm now going to add the cream yarn back into my knitting and show you how to carry yarns. Please note that when you're planning to carry yarns, the stripes must have an even number of rows to them. This just makes it easier anyway when you're doing stripes in flat knitting, but if you're carrying yarns as well, you have to have an even number of rows because you need to come back to the side where you started from, i.e. the side where the carried yarn is being anchored to the knitting. Okay, so now we're going to add the cream yarn using the usual method. Please note that I haven't cut the brown yarn because of course we're going to be now carrying any unused yarn up the side of the knitting instead. So just ignore the brown working yarn at the moment and simply knit with the cream yarn. I'm going to be using the method I just demonstrated to weave in the cream yarn tail as I go. So I've added the cream yarn in for the first stitch, then I carry the cream yarn tail in my left hand, bring it to the front, then back again, then do a normal knit stitch, and then wrap the yarn tail back in, and so on, and I'm going to repeat that 4 times to make sure the tail is secure. And then I'm going to knit all the way back along the row to bring me back to the side where I started the stripe. So at this point we now have both of the working yarns on the right hand side. We're now going to switch to knitting with the brown yarn. So all you do is take your right hand needle up through the top stitch and then start knitting with the brown yarn. Just making sure that the brown yarn is brought up and over the cream yarn so it goes in front of the cream yarn before it's used to start knitting. And again I knit back and forth along the row. Just note that when you carry a yarn that you keep the tension of the carried yarn even and maybe give it a little bit of a tighten up so that the yarn being carried up the side of the knitting is not loose and not just hanging and flopping around. You don't want it to be too tight because then it'll bunch up the side, but you don't want it to be too loose and forming a kind of loop on the side of your knitting, as that looks messy and can be caught on things. So now we're back to the same side. I'm going to switch back to the cream again. So I'm going to bring the cream yarn in front of the brown, so it goes up and over the brown, and again I knit back and forth with that cream yarn. For consistency purposes and to get an even looking edge, I try and bring the same yarn in front of the other every time I switch colours. So I always take the lower yarn over and in front of the upper yarn. And you can see that this technique produces nice, neat stripes. And if we look on the back too, that's also very neat. Okay, so what happens now if I want to carry on knitting with the cream yarn and make the cream stripe a lot wider? What do I do with the brown yarn? Well, all you do is twist the cream and brown yarns together once in a full circle in the same direction that you use when switching the colours. So I take the lower yarn, which is brown, bring it over and in front of the upper yarn, which is cream, and then do the same thing. So I bring the cream yarn, which is the lower yarn, over and above the upper yarn, which is brown. And that twists the 2 working yarns and the 2 colours together. The reason for doing this is to anchor the brown yarn to the side of the knitting using the cream yarn. the brown yarn is being carried. If it wasn't anchored or used every couple of rows, there will be a loose strand of brown yarn just dangling from the knitting on the right hand side, which would obviously look messy and could catch on things. So I'll show you that again. You simply twist the brown and cream yarns together to bring the cream yarn back to the top again, because that's the one we're going to be knitting with now. So then we just carry on knitting with the cream yarn. And again I knit a couple of rows to get me back to where I started. Okay, so I want to carry on knitting with the cream yarn, so again I twist the yarns together, taking the brown over in front of the cream and then the cream over and in front of the brown. And then I just carry on knitting with the cream yarn again. Try to always tighten up the twists to prevent loose yarns on the edges of the knitting. So you do this twisting after every couple of rows. You want to do it regularly so that the carried yarn is not loose. Sometimes it might be necessary to just untwist your working yarns because they can get a bit twisted up during this process. If we look at the back of the knitting, you can see that the brown yarn is clearly being carried up the side of the knitting and is being anchored to the knitting with the cream yarn at regular intervals. You can see that this is mainly at the back or side of the knitting and so is hardly visible from the front of the knitting, if at all. Hopefully I've managed to demonstrate and convince you that this is an efficient method for making stripes. The only downside really is that it adds a little bit of bulk to one side of your knitting, and sometimes the carried yarn can be visible. It does greatly reduce the amount of time that you have to spend adding in different colours, cutting the yarns, and then weaving in the yarn tails. And it's just a far smoother process. Okay, so now I'm going to carry on knitting with the cream yarn, but I'm going to show you a slightly different way of carrying the brown yarn alongside your knitting. What I'm going to do is wrap the brown yarn around the first stitch of the row to create a kind of twisted edge look. This might be completely not to your taste and you might prefer the previous method, which is more common. However, I just wanted to give you an example of what else you could do to carry the yarn. In the method that I previously showed you, you would now twist the working yarns together. But in this method we don't do that. Instead, we slip the first stitch knitwise. So you go into that top stitch as if to knit and slip it onto the right hand needle. You then take both working yarns around the back and hold them with your left hand. You then bring them between the needles to the front, and then you take the slip stitch back onto your left hand needle by slipping it purlwise. So you go down the front of that stitch and slip it back onto the left hand needle. You then take the working yarns and let them drop so they're just hanging at the front of your knitting. And then you simply knit as normal. So you go into the top stitch and do a knit stitch, just picking up the cream yarn to do so. And again I knit 2 rows in the cream colour. You'll notice that the brown yarn now hangs at the front of your knitting. And then you do the same again. So I slip the top stitch knitwise, take the working yarns round to the back, and then from the back go through the needles to the front, and then slip the stitch purlwise back onto the left hand needle. And then let the working yarns hang at the front of the knitting, before then knitting a couple more rows with the cream yarn. So if you like this method of wrapping the brown yarn around the first stitch of every other row, carry on doing it for as long as you're knitting with the cream yarn. If we look at the back of the knitting now, we can start to see what it looks like. and you get a kind of diagonal stitch going up the side of the knitting. And at the front it looks the same as the back. So if you're after a more reversible or even decorative way of carrying yarn up the side of your knitting, then this could be a good method to choose. On the other hand, it's very visible from the front of your knitting, which you might not like at all. It's completely up to you which method you use. If you want to then switch back to the brown yarn, you simply pick up the brown yarn and start knitting with it, rather than picking up the cream yarn. It's as simple as that. And that's the end of my second video all about knitting stripes. If you'd like to learn how to knit with 3 colours, then I'll be covering that in my next video. I really hope this video has been useful to you, and thank you very much for watching.